You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. On this episode of Radio Free Humanity, we are celebrating the new Spanish edition of our co-host Andrew Kleinman's book, Reclaiming Marxist Capital. The original English version was released in 2007, but now, in 2020, you can read the book in Spanish. Joining us today is Guillem Murcia Lopez, who, along with Antonio Dorado, was one of the translators of the book. Guillem, Andrew, and I will be discussing the book and its relevance now for theory and practice. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleinman.
To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. In a few minutes, we'll be talking about the Spanish edition of Reclaiming Marxist Capital, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about some current events. So, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wabagon, out in the prairie.
Yeah, where all the presidents are above average.
That's my only cultural reference point for Minnesota. So, it's my only Minnesota joke I can make. So, events are unfolding so rapidly and dramatically here in the U.S. that it is hard to make sense of what is happening and where things are headed. Whether it's descent into chaos or ascent into something new, we don't know. But Marxist-Humanist Initiative was able to put together an editorial that came out today, June 2nd. And I think it's pretty good. It gets to some of the essential issues at stake in this protest. So our plan for this podcast is just to move through the sections of the editorial and use that as our guide for discussing the uprising.
Yeah, the title of the editorial is U.S. Explodes with Protests Over Police Murder of George Floyd.
And the first section of the piece is entitled Mass Interracial Solidarity Against Police Violence. And it points out that one of the things that really differentiates this movement from the urban rebellions of the 1960s is its interracial character, something we didn't see a lot of in the 60s.
Right. In Detroit, 1967, that had a white-black, character. That was different, though. In the main, it was not that way. But what I've been seeing is a lot of white youth, people of all races, young people who really know what the cops are about and really loathe the cops. It's not just a black thing that you wouldn't understand anymore.
Yeah, and that's one of the aspects that's made this protest movement much more threatening to the powers that be.
Yeah. It's in the second paragraph. This is one of the takeaways of one of the main documents of Marxist-Humanism, pamphlet American Civilization on Trial, written by Raya Dunevskaya at the time of the original 1963 March on Washington. And it puts out a lot of history, and the point of the history of the U.S. is that pivotal moments of forward movement in the U.S. have always been those moments when white working people took their lead from the black masses and coalesced with them. So it's not
just a casual observation or a slogan or something. It's based on a real assessment of the role of black activism at the vanguard of forward movement in U.S. politics.
Right, and that's, like it or not, that's critical because black people are a minority in this country. So unless we manage to have a substantial core of white people who forsake at some level the white privilege, reject white supremacism, that puts a damper on everything. That, strangles forward movement. The other main takeaway from the pamphlet is that racism is the Achilles heel of U.S. civilization. I mean, it prevents this really from being a civilized country. As Gandhi put it, Western civilization is a wonderful idea. I'd like to see it. And we're seeing that play out in the streets. But when you get white working people coalescing with the black masses struggling for freedom, then you can really go somewhere. And that's where we're at right now. I mean, I'm not predicting that this is going to go upward and onward. I'm not predicting it's going to be crushed mercilessly. Some of both is happening right now. But that's what it's going to take.
The second part of the editorial is called Cops Not Invincible, and I really appreciated this part of the editorial. I think it put into words something I hadn't quite all put together in my head yet, and that was the way the protesters storming and burning down of the third precinct in Minneapolis on May 28th, the way that seemed to have acted as a catalyst for spreading this movement all around the country. In my whole life, I had never imagined I would see protesters take over a police station and set it on fire. I've always, in protests and other places, I've always seen the cops as this like insurmountable mass of weaponry and technology and intimidation, and sort of basically a bunch of armed thugs that can do whatever they want and with no accountability. And here you had, for the first time I can ever remember, this people who pierced through that aura of invincibility and showed the world that these cops are not invincible. And that seemed to have inspired people all over the country to take to the streets.
I've seen one mention of this part from the MHI editorial, but I mean, that's the way it struck me, and I just sort of said, God, it's got to strike other people the same way. It struck you the same way, correct?
Yeah, it was incredible. It immediately reminded me of the protest movement in Hong Kong last summer, where all those young people stormed the Parliament building and where they were live streaming from inside the Parliament, and the whole world had this idea, this image of this, that the Communist Party of China had been sort of put on notice that they were not invincible.
People begin to take heart that not only can you struggle, but you can win.
The next part of the editorial is called Trump Racist in Chief, and it briefly describes some of the predictably horrible responses that Trump has had to this movement so far, and also tries to contextualize the movement a little bit within what's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic right now and the gross racial disparities that have been exposed by this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, this is not like something that we see in terms of like signs that people are holding or, when they get interviewed. They're very much focused on the issue of police violence and the racial inequality more generally. But we're in a situation right now where really at a mass level for the first time in a very long time, there are lots of people with nothing to lose. Everything's been taken away from them already.
Right, and people are now being asked to do this total about face. They made all these sacrifices. They lost their jobs. They dealt with all this quarantining and drama for months, and now governors and the president is just saying, okay, we're back open for business, as if it's somehow safe, but it's not safe. And then people are wondering, why do we make all these sacrifices if it's not safe? And they feel compelled to go back to work even though it's not safe there.
There was an about face done. Okay, so Trump wanted to look the other way, do nothing, but then it became worse and worse, and they began to listen to the experts, impose social distancing, recommend social distancing, but it still gets worse. The right-wing media and all of this pushing back, and it becomes clear that it's hitting immigrants in meatpacking plants, it's hitting the black population, it's hitting the cities, it's hitting the blue states, and they say, like, the hell with it, we're not going to be able to contain this thing anyway, so let's snatch victory from the jaws of defeat and say the key thing is to get the economy back to work. Obviously, they got the CEOs of companies screaming and yelling about that at the same time. So they did an about face, okay? And what they've basically tried to do is to just like ignore this, get us off of it, and to basically tell people in sometimes no uncertain terms that you have to sacrifice your life, you have to risk your well-being for the good of the so-called economy. Absolutely disgusting stuff, like former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, saying, people were willing to sacrifice in World War II to defend our way of life. I mean, whether you like World War II or not, what that references to is a war against fascism. Okay, it's not spending, to put money in the hands of corporations and drive up stock prices. It's a very different way of life that he's talking about from that. It was absolutely disgusting.
And now people are being told they have to go back to work or they'll lose their unemployment benefits, but it might not be safe to go to work. It might not be safe to get on the train to go to work.
Yeah, this is forced labor.
So people are out there protesting police brutality, but there are a lot of other things people are pissed off about right now. The next part of the article is called Charging the Minneapolis Cops, and it talks about how while at first there were no charges against any of the police officers, the day after the precinct building was burnt down, all of a sudden we saw the first charge against Officer Chauvin, third-degree murder charge. Obviously, people are still pissed and they want a first-degree murder charge. They want the other cops tried as well. But if there hadn't been a movement, if people hadn't been out there in the streets, we might not have seen any action at this point.
Yeah, that third-degree murder charge is really pathetic because third-degree murder carries a much lighter sentence, and the reason is it's not a charge of premeditated murder. This clearly was premeditated murder in the legal sense, not that the cops got on the scene and say, okay, let's kill this guy. You don't need that for premeditation. But getting a premeditated murder conviction against cops is like almost impossible, and that's the reason that the prosecutors didn't go for it, is because they didn't think that they could get that conviction, and clearly that's the issue. And even people who are on the side of racial justice are saying, well, this is a good decision on their part because it's really hard to get a conviction on premeditated murder for the cops, and even what they've charged them with, when we see all the evidence, the 9 minutes, even this is not a slam dunk case. But this is what makes it so pathetic, is how little people are willing to settle for.
The next part of the article is called Police Riot, Trump Flees to Underground Bunker, and it talks about this crazy escalation of police violence and rioting that we've seen over the past week as cops have responded to this perception of their own weakness with increased brutality, but it seems to be backfiring on them this time because now the whole world is watching, as the article says, and all over the internet and everyone's watching these videos of police doing crazy, irresponsible, violent things in response to peaceful protests.
What you've gotten to is the irony that then gets pointed out in the next paragraph. They're losing in a certain sense. Not only are they losing like the 3rd Precinct station and some of the fights on the ground, they're losing in the eyes of the world because the image of like the cops are your friends and here to protect you. They're here to protect something and some people, but they're not our friends, right? They are not our friends. People can see this now. Everybody can see this. So they're losing. And so how do they respond to the fact that they are being now perceived correctly to be brutal thugs? They up their brutality and thuggishness,
Yeah, I mean, this is their MO. This is the only thing they know how to do, is to escalate things and use their weapons and be a bunch of thugs. The last section of the piece is called An Entire Generation Radicalized Within a Week, and it talks about how over the course of 7 days, this interracial youth movement has arisen with the youth in the vanguard here.
Yeah, I mean, I got a sense in particular from what our friend in Brooklyn was saying that there were people who were not only outraged but also surprised, shocked by the enormity of the police violence unleashed on them. That has, a tremendous radicalizing effect because there's no way more sure to understand capitalism as a system than to see a system coming down on you. And that's what it is. It's not this cop or that cop, right? It's the system, and people can make connections from that. So and people do not like being tear gassed and shot with rubber bullets and driven through with SUVs and stuff like that. So whether we win or lose right now, there's going to be a price to be paid.
Yeah, even if this movement gets crushed by the military or something, an entire generation is going to remember this moment of power and of the real weakness of the cops and the powers that be, and the power of movements of people on the streets taking charge of their own lives and demanding a better society. People are not going to forget that. Well, that's all the time we have for this current events section. Up next, we talk about the Spanish edition of Reclaiming Marx's Capital.
We're very pleased to have on the podcast today Guillem Murcia Lopez, who is the co-translator of the just released Spanish edition of my 2007 book, Reclaiming Marx's Capital. And he's going to talk about the translation process and political implications perhaps for Spain and so forth. I don't feel qualified to say the Spanish title and subtitle, but maybe Guillem, you can render that for us.
Yeah. of course. Well, hello, very pleased to be with you. The Spanish title is Reivindicando el capital de Marx, una refutación del mito de su incoherencia.
Well, Guillem, thanks so much for being with us today. It's great to have you on the podcast. We're excited about the this new Spanish edition of the book coming out. Could you talk a little bit about what the possible reception for the book might be? You know, what is the political situation in Spain? Are people looking for a book like this? Do you think there's an audience for a book like this? What kind of impact might it have?
Yeah, well, I think it is relevant because I think interest in Marx has been increasing, at least in Spain, and I would say that also in Latin America, especially since the Great Recession. And it's also something that has been attracting people because especially younger people are becoming more aware about the challenges that are being brought up, like global warming. So it is relevant because it addresses accusations that have been made against Marx theory for a lot of time. There is discussion of Marxist ideas in Spain. There's a lot of people. It's just coming from different perspectives. You have people like Professor Xavier Arrizabalo, who invited Andrew a few years ago. That's when I met Andrew, actually, when he came to Spain. He's teaching, Arrizabalo is teaching a diploma at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, and he's got people involved in his teaching, in his classes that who are working on raising awareness on Marxist ideas and who are also political activists. You got people like Maxi Nieto, who is involved in a group I'm also involved with, actually, called THIPCOM, who are trying to use Marxist ideas to expose the irrationality of the capitalist mode of production and we're trying to propose alternatives to overcome it. And I'm sure I'm missing a lot of people, not only in academia, but the activists and journalists and people who are involved or who are at least partial or who follow some of Marx's ideas. The thing is that it is relevant because even though some people have been, or there's growing awareness and interest in Marx's ideas, I think that the accusations that Andrew refutes in his book are usually, I don't know if I will say they're not an obstacle to some people becoming interested in Marx, but they're an obstacle to more people getting interested and getting a more solid support for Marx's ideas. Because if you have an author that is constantly being accused of being inconsistent, that his ideas are inconsistent, that he's old-fashioned, that he's been overcome, you might get interested in him. But if you only listen to his critics, you probably are not going to pay a lot of attention to what he says. Maybe you'll try to get around that, like some people do, and say, hey, the things that the accusations that they make against him, they're valid, and we concede the point, but those points are not really that important. We can still salvage this or that thing from Marx's ideas. But I think it makes his ideas much more powerful if you show that he's not inconsistent, that if you read him in a way that makes sense of his whole theoretical project, it makes sense, it is consistent with what he's been saying, and his ideas can be used to criticize capitalism in a way that is much more powerful than if you just use him in order to repeat a few slogans or some catchphrases or for a t-shirt, which is cool. I mean, slogans are very important too, and getting people interested at the first stages of becoming interested in some of his ideas are probably, you're not going to be delving into a lot of theoretical issues. But once you get past that point, if you reach a stage where everything you read about him is like he was wrong, he contradicted himself, it's probably going to either turn you away from him or make you drop some of the key aspects of his ideas. So I think the book Reivindicando el Capital de Marx in Spanish is very important because it takes the challenge, those myths, those accusations, he faces them head on and just obliterates them.
Yeah. Listening to you sort of talk about the relevance of the book reminds me of my own experience of reading and Reclaiming Marx's Capital for the first time a while ago now. And my experience of, learning about Marx for the first time was that I was told from the beginning, I remember in school, that there was something internally inconsistent or even wrong with Marx's value theory, and the specific theses of his about exploitation and crisis just couldn't be done within the framework of his value theory. And I was really steered toward all of these correctors of Marx. and their own, with all of them with their own unique reinterpretations. And
Yeah.
I spent years, sort of going from book to book, from different school of thought to the next, trying to sort of wrestle with all these different Marxian ideas.
Hmm.
So when I read Andrew's book, Reclaiming Marx's Capital, for the first time, it was a real eye-opener because I was given permission to read Marx for himself and not feel like I had to interpret Marx through someone who was speaking for Marx and sort of correcting his mistakes.
Hmm.
One of the things Andrew talks about in the book is that the prominence of this myth of inconsistency is really buoyed up by the careerism of the correctors, that everyone, all these Marxist intellectuals, they really base their academic careers and their writing careers around their own unique corrections of Marx, and this really sustains the whole phenomenon of this inability of Marx to be allowed to speak for himself. You do find this sort of careerism is also an issue in Spain, in the Spanish-speaking world. Are there people that kind of have their own thought silos and schools of thought that people gravitate to, that are sort of presented as corrections of Marx?
I'm not familiar with any Spanish-speaking authors coming up with corrections for Marx. And from what I've seen, I might be wrong. I might not have read everyone or someone who has done that. But from what I've seen, a lot of people tend to repeat the arguments or the corrections that other authors have made, just translating them or incorporating them into their own works or whatever. I'm not familiar with anyone that has come up with a so-called correction of what Marx said on his own. It's all repeating what American or maybe German authors have come up.
Well, fair enough. So, Guillaume, how did you first come across Reclaiming Marx's Capital?
Oh, well, I actually first learned about it thanks to Antonio, the co-translator. And at first, I wasn't really that aware of the so-called problem of transformation, the controversy over the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. All of those debates kind of escaped me because I wasn't really that familiar with them. So in a way, it was good because I would say I wasn't that contaminated by the different corrections. So at first I started reading it, and the thing that struck me is that there were some parts I found really accessible. Andrew really, he is a professor, so he's used to explaining things in an accessible way, I guess. And a lot of the explanations he gives for more complex points in Marxist theory were very eye-opening. Then I got to some of the parts which were more math heavy, and I started struggling a bit. So I was like, oh, maybe I won't be able to understand this. Maybe this is just not for me. Maybe the experts need to sort all of this out. But one of the messages, I guess, that goes through the whole book is that you should try to. I think Andrew mentions it at the beginning when he mentions I think it was Ted McClone who asked him why should he need to why do you think there is a transformation problem? Why? And then he says he sat down and started figuring out the solution he gives in the book. And the message I got from it was that of course you need to rely on the knowledge of people who've come before you, but you shouldn't accept stuff that's being said just because someone says, hey, I'm an expert on this. If someone is an expert on something, I think he should be able to explain that to people and make it accessible. And I think that's what Andrew does in the book. One of the things I did when I was struggling with some of the chapters is that I printed the translation I was making and I carried it around with a pencil, and I kept making notes and trying to work out all of the mathematical examples and stuff. And eventually I got it, and I eventually understood it. Well, I must say that I also needed a bit of a few clarifications from Andrew. I emailed him privately to ask him some of the examples he made. Like I couldn't get my head around, but overall it was very, I don't know, it was a very cool exercise in seeing that you don't need to take something for granted or something that is like that because an authority said so.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that. I think I had a similar experience myself when I read Reclaiming Marx's Capital for the first time. I think probably prior to that, everything I'd read about the transformation problem or Ochicio's theorem had just been a summary of the arguments, and we're not ever actually walking the reader through the actual math and the assumptions behind the math, and it was left to the readers just to take the word of experts that Marx was wrong on these points. And even now, looking back, I think probably some of these correctors of Marx probably couldn't do the math either, and they were just sort of relying on other people's authority. Um, but when I read Andrew's book, it was the first time I really felt encouraged to actually, not take anything for granted and like work through all of the math examples in the book myself to make sure I really understood them and agreed with them, or even sometimes like, create my own reproduction tables with different sets of numbers and make sure I really understood how it all worked and how it would all add up the right way. And it even led me to become, I think, more confident in trying to work through math examples and other literature that I wouldn't have tried to before in the past, like even things like Ian Stevens' Marx after Sraffa and things like that. And then to really start to analyze the assumptions behind the math.
I keep reading examples of what you mentioned, like authors just assuming that Marx was wrong and just hand waving it away. Like I'm working on a chapter for a book, and just recently I was reading this paper where some guy, I think he was, if I'm not wrong, he was sympathetic to the analytical Marxist school. So he was just mentioning how the Marxist theory of value was bankrupt. And he just said it like that, he didn't even explain. He just said we needed to assume that. I think he mentioned some authors, like go read them if you. But he didn't even explain in a single paragraph what was bankrupt about it. So it's so common, and then a lot of people might read that. I might have read that years ago and be like, oh yeah, I guess that he couldn't get everything right, which is true. He couldn't have got everything right. Okay, but why is that wrong?
Right. One thing I want to say is, I mean, the way that you guys have been raising it, it makes it like, oh well, Kleinman's this master expositor, and he has this like uncanny ability, unparalleled to explain things clearly. I don't think that that's the case. I think most of these people are very bright, and if they wanted to, they could have done at least as good a job as I did. So I think that one has to ask, why does this stuff again and again come out obscure, abstruse, impossible for lay people to understand? What is the strategy going on?
I would say there are a lot of factors in that. I mean, not to be a functionalist or anything, or to resort to conspiracy or whatever, but I think that it is probably easier to repeat a myth if it helps to avoid conflict. I don't know if it makes sense. In a way that some of the points Marx made that are being considered, bankrupt or that should be abandoned and stuff, really point out to the root of the mode of production that is capitalism, that is riddled with contradictions, with conflict, with irrationalities. And if you're going to point it out, it's going to be more difficult to you because it's sort of like showing the ugly side, And if you show not, let's say, the beautiful side of capitalism, but at least its redeeming face, that, if you try to argue, okay, it's got some of the stuff wrong, but it's not really riddled with internal contradictions. It can be tamed. It can have a human face, like I think it was Sarkozy who said that we need to reinvent capitalism, and a lot of people might agree with you. So of course, because some of the people to profit from it, and some of the people are very comfortable with the way things are, and they might accept a few changes here and there. They might accept the general idea of we need reforms, we need to change some stuff because they're not blind. They see some of the very horrible effects that capitalism has. But when you point out that those horrible effects, they in some way they come from the very nature, how the way the system operates, and unless you change that way, that essence, unless you get rid of it, you're not going to do away with the horrible effects. Then that's a very bold thing to say, and there's a lot of at stake there. I think even within the left, Like if you want to propose minor changes, if you want to reach the institutions, it's difficult to do so if you keep pointing out, yeah, but the way the system works is wrong in the way it works, not in this aspect, in this side of it. No, the way it works, its inner workings. So it makes it easier to try to sell some hope if you say, no, well, we can change some of it, we can tame it down. And
One of the things that Andrew and I have discussed on this podcast before and in other contexts as well, I'm sure, has just been the general institutional inertia, especially in the academic institutions, but just also in the left in general, the inertia to having like a general acceptance of this idea that Marx had a internally consistent, valid theory of value and capitalism that stands on its own without the need of correctors. So much of the left is siloed into these independent sort of camps and schools of thought based around sort of these correctors of Marx who think they have a better theory than Marx, but still present themselves as the inheritors of Marx.
Yeah.
And it's been difficult to get some of the arguments in this book to be accepted by people like that, because it's really threatening to their academic careers and to their sort of prestige in the left world. I'm curious if you have thoughts about how a book like this might have an effect on discussions of Marx in Spain and in the Spanish-speaking world, and also, what strategies or what the possibilities for overcoming these sort of institutional and cultural obstacles to the arguments in the book.
I think that more than changing minds, which I think it can change minds, of course. If you, Andrew gave the example of the capital controversy, I think it was, when one of the sides does accept the other side's arguments and they acknowledge that they were wrong. And it's a very honest example of the scientific spirit, which should be to try to reach the truth about the matter. I think that might be difficult if people are very entrenched in some ideas, and I don't know. But I think that the main benefit that the book could bring, I think, is people who are maybe not so invested in a certain school reading interpretation of Marx to at least have a more, even if it's just a pluralistic approach to the matter, to know that there's another way, an interpretation that doesn't need to change stuff. I remember a couple of years ago there was this debate. I think it was a symposium on if it was 200 years ago, I think it was the 200th anniversary of the birth, Marx. They had this debate on the Universidad Complutense, and you had a professor there, a lecturer, I think it's in philosophy, who's one of the co-authors of a very influential book on Marx's Capital in Spain. His name is Luis Alegre, and he writes a lot of interesting stuff. But in that book, he presents a very particular reading of Marx, and he drops some of the stuff or says that Marx was wrong. Well, the drill, right? He was wrong about this and that. One of the things, the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Well, in the symposium, he mentions his own book and he says, well, I'm paraphrasing, maybe I'm not getting every single word, but the gist was there. Every reading of Marx finds something that you need to drop, that is, superfluous, that doesn't make sense within the whole thing. And our reading only found a few things. One of them was the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and this and that. So just a very, very few minor things. So yeah, the thing is that it's perfectly legitimate for someone to state that opinion. Okay, but if at least you have a pluralistic approach to the matter and you said there's another interpretation, you can see that that's not true, because not every reading needs to drop those so-called, or as I said, minor things or minor points in Marx's theory. There is an interpretation that doesn't need to drop that. If people want to take the other interpretation, want to follow that, well, okay, let's debate about that. But at least the fact that there is a book that shows that you don't need to do that, I think that's a good thing for people who are approaching the matter, who are learning about it.
We should say that not only were Guillem and Antonio the translators of the book, but Guillem was the one who pitched this concept to the publisher in the first place to get this book, to create this Spanish edition of the book. So we're really grateful for all the hard work that's been done for this. It's my understanding this has been a 5-year project, started in 2015 and just ending here in 2020, of working on this book. So it's taken a lot of hard work. And it's not easy to put together a translation of a specialist text like this. I know that there was an attempt to get a Spanish edition from an Argentinian group in the past, and that kind of fell through. So we're glad this really happened this time.
That's always the major problem is for a book like this or my other book, getting somebody to translate, because you need more than just good knowledge of both languages and good translation skills and good work habits. You actually need some expertise, and some ability to discern technical stuff here. So getting a translator is a big problem. So it's been very difficult. I mean, some people, their stuff gets picked up and translated like kind of regularly, even on the left, even in so-called Marxist circles. But this kind of thing, no. There are very strong forces that don't want to give up the myth of inconsistency or several related myths. There are people, really what you were saying, Brendan, there are people whose careers are built on not just that Marx made errors. Why would a career be built on that? Well, the career is built on that because you can have your cake and eat it too. On the one hand, Marx made the errors, but we are the inheritors to Marx. My approach, my new thing. I can rescue everything. So I'm better than Marx. Follow me. Don't follow Marx. I'm better than Marx, but I do all the stuff that you would want to get from Marx. Okay, that's the way this works again and again and again. And, if there were no inconsistencies, they would have to invent them. And that's exactly what they did.
Yeah, and I think that's why your work and the work of the other TSSI folks has been so infuriating to so many of these correctors of Marx. You're really exposing this substitutionism they do when they substitute themselves for Marx and try to speak for Marx, and instead saying to people, hey, look, no, Marx has his own thing which is internally consistent, and you can compare that to what these other people say, but don't let the two don't confuse the two. And that really kind of ruins their whole operation, their whole MO.
Yeah, and their material interest there. I always think of it as, how dare me taking bread out of the mouths of simultaneous children.
In just a few moments, we're going to get into some of the details of Reclaiming Marxist Capital, some of the main themes of the book. But first, a few words from Anne Jacquard of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors our podcast.
Hello, this is Anne Jacquard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's political, economic, and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice.
So this is a podcast about the Spanish edition of Reclaiming Marxist Capital, but we should probably spend some time just talking about the book in general for those who are not familiar with the arguments in the book. Reclaiming Marxist Capital is a refutation of the idea that there is something internally inconsistent with Marx. It spends a lot of time refuting the idea that there is a transformation problem with Marx's value theory. So we can't cover all the details here, but maybe we could at least cover some of the basics. Andrew, do you want to maybe start us off by just explaining to listeners what the transformation problem is and isn't?
Sure. And in fact, this is something that most people get wrong just in terms of historically what the problem is alleged to be, and they confuse the properties of what is supposedly Marx's error with properties of the so-called correction of Marx. But let me kind of take it from the top. In Volume 3 of Capital, Marx confronts the facts of life, the fact that the way the world of appearances works, what we observe, that doesn't conform to the categories and concepts of Volume 1 of Capital. So there are the essence categories of Volume 1 and 2 of Capital. The forms of appearance are different, and Marx gets into that in Volume 3. And one thing that's different is, in Volume 1, Marx talks about the value is produced and the surplus value is produced, and you get the sense of that's what the business, captures, is the surplus value. Sells the product at its value. But that's not what happens. Firms sell their products at prices that differ from their values, and they get correspondingly an amount of profit that differs from the amount of surplus value that is produced in their particular production process. Okay, so at that point you say, well, gee, what the hell is left of value theory? We got the value, we got the surplus value, but how can it possibly matter, because the prices differ and the profit differ. And what Marx says is, at the industry level, and at the level of a firm, price differs from the value, the profit that they get differs from the surplus value extracted. But looking at the system as a whole, all those differences cancel out. It's a zero-sum game. You sum up all of the prices, it equals the sum of all of the values. You sum up all of the profits, it equals all the sum of the surplus values. So the law of value, the determination of value by labor time, does hold, but not at the level of a firm, not at the level of an industry, but at the level of the aggregate, the total economy. Okay? And what Marx basically does is to show how this works at the level of the whole economy, given certain industries. Here are their surplus values, here's their values, okay, here's what the profit's going to be, here's what the prices are going to be, here's the rate of profit, it doesn't change at the level of the economy as a whole. He shows that for the case in which, it's a special case, it doesn't hold true in reality, but he shows this for the special case in which the rate of profit is equalized across sectors. Okay, so, every industry realizes the same rate of profit, and the prices it gets are correspondingly prices of production. So basically then, what Marx is doing is saying here, the determination of value by labor time does hold true at the level of the aggregate economy. Okay, that's the upshot of his transformation. Okay, he refers to the transformation of commodity values into prices of production. So he's talking about a transformation in the way these things appear in the real world as opposed to how they, operate on a more stark theoretical level. That's transformation. Okay, so from the start, the moment this was published, there were all these criticisms of what he was doing. And probably the most famous one was by Vladislav von Bortkiewicz, right at the turn of, or maybe 1907. And he alleged that the transformation procedure, or example, so to speak, the way that Marx said this operated is internally contradictory because it would lead to a spurious breakdown of the economy. In other words, if you imagine that the economy was like in a steady state, also known as simple reproduction, if the commodities were to sell at their values, then the moment that they don't sell at their values, but they sell at prices of production that allow an equal rate of profit to happen, the economy would just go out of whack. There would not be a balance. There would be, shortages here and the excesses there. So he says, I've proved that Marx was guilty of internal contradiction, and in a companion paper, von Bortkiewicz says, okay, here's how you have to correct Marx. The problem is that when he changed the outputs from being priced at their values to being priced at prices of production, he didn't transform also the inputs. In other words, the means of production and so forth that were used to produce the stuff. Marx was assuming that those were purchased at their values instead of at their prices of production. And you got to do both sides, the inputs and the outputs, transform them both into prices of production. Well, the problem is when you do that, you sever. If everything is such that there's values of inputs, values of outputs, and a separate prices of inputs and prices of outputs, you've just rendered two separate systems that have no relationship to one another. That's what you've got there. And as a result, in this alleged correction by Bortkiewicz, that was his term, in this alleged correction, Marx's basic results just no longer hold true. But that's a property not of any proof of Bortkiewicz, that's a property of his so-called correction. Okay, so in other words, for instance, you can by fiat declare that the sum of values equals the sum of prices, but then the rate of profit does not get preserved as you move from values to prices, and the total surplus value doesn't reappear as total profit, or something like that. So basically, in the so-called corrections, the law of value, determination of labor time, goes out the window. And so the whole issue is, did Marx, so to speak, forget to transform the inputs? Do the inputs need to be transformed? And that's just been taken as given. When I started all of this was like, this was taken to be gospel truth. That was 1986. I think it's still taken to be gospel truth in some quarters. Marx forgot to transform the inputs. You have to transform the inputs, and they just don't want to give that up. But it's nonsense. And the reason it's nonsense is because if you remember in this whole story, Bortkiewicz claims to prove that we would involve ourselves in internal contradictions by having the transformation work the way Marx said. The specific internal contradiction is you would get a breakdown of the economy that's a spurious breakdown. Well, in 1986, I showed that that's not true. And I showed it again and again and again. It's very easy to show. It's in the book. There are a few other examples floating around, but yeah, the basic thing is the outputs of one production period, or let's say 1 year, don't have to have the same prices as the inputs at the beginning of the year. So it doesn't matter whether the inputs sold for these prices or that prices, these prices or those prices. Everything can be bought and sold at its prices. The markets can clear. There's no breakdown in reproduction as long as you're not trying to make the outputs of the period sell, for the prices of the beginning of that period. The outputs at the end of a period exchange right at that moment, they become the inputs of the next period. So I recognized that kind of like immediately dawned on me in March of 1986, or maybe it was January of 1986. It was early on, and that's it. There's nothing to correct. There's no spurious breakdown, nothing to correct. And Marx might be right, he might be wrong, but there's no internal inconsistency in what he did with the transformation.
So, Reclaiming Marxist Capital is a book about the temporal single system interpretation, or the TSSI, and which is a school of thought that you've been involved with for decades now, which has tried to refute these myths of internal inconsistency in Marxist value theory. We should go through for listeners what those three terms, temporal, single system, and interpretation, mean. Let's start with interpretation. Why is the TSSI called an interpretation?
This is hugely important in my mind because way too much of so-called Marxist economics and related stuff is built on people hawking their approaches. And here's my approach and here's the other one's approach. And what happens then is Marx drops off the map. He's just not there anymore. And the TSSI has done a really good job at damaging the allegations of internal inconsistency. And as a result, what the opponents of it have more and more tried to emphasize is that they have a better approach than the TSSI approach. But this is just phony. It's an invalid comparison because the TSSI is actually an interpretation, an exegetical interpretation. It stands or falls with how well it makes the text make sense, which is the job of an exegetical interpretation. If it makes text make sense, then whether you like it as a way of doing economics, whether you can open your cans with it, polish your floors, none of that matters. Its job is to make text make sense. There are these other interpretations out there. There are interpretations, there are approaches, they're whatever they are. But the point is, insofar as there are claims that Marx did this, it was internally inconsistent and not, those claims need to be evaluated in terms of, are these true or are these not true? Does the text need to be read in a way in which Marx turns out to be internally inconsistent, or is there a different way? to do it. So I really insist that this is an interpretation, because it really is phony to try to turn this into an approach, and this is Kleiman's view, and this is the way, Alan Freeman, and, this is what they like to emphasize. None of that is what's really going on. What is really going on is an invasion of a very simple question. Did Marx make these errors? Did he commit these internal contradictions? So there's obviously, with all of these allegations, there's a discrepancy between what Marx says and what the critics say. But the question is, whose fault is that? Is that Marx's fault? Is that present in his actual text the problem? Or is the contradiction between what he said and what they come up with, is the contradiction due to the failings of their interpretation? So I want to hold their feet to the fire on the fact that they have an obligation to interpret the text, okay? Because they are making claims. When you say it's internally inconsistent, you are making claims about what's actually in the text. And look, you have to prove it. And I think it's absolutely undeniable now they haven't proven a thing.
Well, that's very clear. So why temporal and why single system?
Okay, temporal. Well, for anybody who heard the rap about von Bortkiewicz, one way of understanding the weirdness of his correction and the weirdness of his attempt to try to prove Marx internally inconsistent is that Bortkiewicz was alleging that the problem came because the prices of the outputs at the end of a period differed from the prices of the inputs at the beginning of the period. So you might have coal. Coal, in the economy is used as an input to fire up furnaces. Coal is also an output of the coal industry. And, you get at the beginning of the period, coal is bought as an input to fire up furnaces at a price of $6. And at the end of the period, coal is mined and the price is $6.50. And in Bortkiewicz's rendition, this is an internal contradiction, or it leads to internal contradiction, and you can't have that. The prices of the coal at the beginning of the period have to equal the price of the coal at the end of the period, per unit, per pound of coal, per ton of coal, whatever it might be. And that's not true. So the temporality consists of the simple idea, and it's a fact, that the prices of inputs at the beginning of a period differ. They can differ, they do differ from the prices of the same thing later on at the end of the same period. Okay? That's like not a feature of standard Marxian economics, and that's not a feature of these so-called corrections of Marx. It is a feature of the real world. It's clearly a feature of the way Marx understood the economy and theorized about it. Okay, so it all comes down to, do the prices of inputs per unit have to equal the prices of outputs? That's what temporal was all about. Temporalists, we say, no, they don't have to be equal. The simultaneists, they do various things, but the way they do it, the upshot is always, yes, the prices of the inputs have to, for this or that reason, equal the prices of the outputs, even though they know they're not making a claim that's true to the real world.
And then the term single system refers to the fact that in Bortkiewicz's correction, because he values everything simultaneously, inputs and outputs at the same time, that breaks into two different systems, one of prices and values, that can't be reconciled. Whereas if you consider things temporally, as input and output prices not having to be the same, then you can speak of values and prices in one system.
Right. That has to do, with Bortkiewicz saying that you got to transform the inputs. So you've got the outputs selling at prices that differ from values. The inputs got to sell at the same prices that different values. So you end up with one system of prices as for inputs equal to the prices of the outputs. Another system, values of the inputs equal to the value of the outputs. Those are your two systems, your price system, your value system. And that's what causes, Marx's results not to hold true, is that you've just created a new so-called price system where it has no relationship to production of value, the law of value, or anything else. It's actually a very simple issue. Once you no longer force the prices of the inputs to equal the prices of the outputs, you don't have to, sever the economy into two discordant systems that have nothing to do with one another. And the result of that is that, the internal inconsistency of the law of value and all of this apparent stuff, that all goes away.
So, Andrew, your book, Reclaiming Marxist Capital, also challenges this popular notion that there is something internally inconsistent or wrong with Marx's theory of crisis, his theory of the law of the tendential fall and the rate of profit. And, applying the similar set of tools and logic, you deconstruct that claim and argue that there's nothing wrong with the way Marx theorizes the long-term fall in the rate of profit. Do you want to go into that here?
Right. What happened is relatively shortly after I, along with Ted McClone, discovered that there was a way of reading Marx that eliminated the internal inconsistency, the apparent internal inconsistency in his account of the transformation from values to prices of production. Shortly after that, I just took a look at the Okishio theorem, a theorem by the late Japanese Marxist economist Nobuo Okishio, which was held to have proven that, Marx made an error or was internally inconsistent in his law, Marx's law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And, you get in Okishio, just like with Bortkiewicz, a correction. And, when Okishio corrects Marx, lo and behold, it is no longer possible for the rate of profit to fall for the reason that Marx stated. Not if the rate of profit is equalized beforehand and re-equalized later on, and the capitalists who invest in new technologies, mechanized labor-saving technologies, if they're concerned to be profit maximizers, under those conditions, it is not possible, according to Okishio, according to his model, it is not possible for the new labor-saving technology to cause the rate of profit to fall. Okay, so that's incredibly devastating to, first of all, the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit, but to Marx's theory of capitalist crisis, the notion that these crises are in some senses inevitable, a lot of issues like that. Well, lo and behold, the problem with what Okishio did is the same problem with what Bortkiewicz did, and the same problem that they all do. They force the inputs to be priced at the same prices as the outputs that later emerge. And in the case of the Okishio theorem, it's even more weird because here we're not just talking about one period, but we're talking about, like, you might be producing bricks, let's say. You got an enterprise, they produce bricks. And how do they produce bricks? Well, they got a brickworks, so they got like a factory, and it's made out of bricks. And they invested in the bricks, 30 years ago, and they're producing bricks today. Well, the way the Okishio theorem tries to understand the economy and the rate of profit and the size of the rate of profit is, the price of the bricks 30 years ago when you invested $10,000, okay, well, we wiped that out because that $10,000 was based on a price of 10 cents per brick. Well, nowadays, bricks are 14 cents per brick. So we got to revalue the investment that you made 30 years ago at today's price. Well, yeah, that rate of profit, so-called, is not going to fall where you've retroactively revalued the investment at the end of the period prices of today. That's not going to fall due to technological change. But that's not what people mean by a rate of profit. It's not what business people mean. It's not what the financial community means. It's not what Marx meant. It's not a rate of profit. A rate of profit is profit as a percentage of the actual amount of money that was invested in the past. So you're comparing something selling today at today's prices with an investment, wherein you purchased means of production and, constructed factories, whatever, way back in the past based on the past price. So it's absolutely fatal, but it's also totally nuts to, when you think about the determination of the rate of profit, to think of revaluing an investment. It's like polishing the polish. The investment is what it was. You can't change the fact of, how much money was committed and comparing profit to that. You can look at some other thing, like what would be the profit today if we were to reinvest today. That's maybe an interesting question, but it's not the thing that Marx was talking about when he talked about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. He was talking about profit today as a percentage of the actual amount of funds invested in the past. So in other words, his account, his account was temporal, not simultaneous. It was not forcing the prices of the inputs to equal the prices of the outputs at the same period.
Well, I think that's a pretty good summary. If you haven't read the book and you want to know more, of course, you should check out Reclaiming Marxist Capital, now available in Spanish. Speaking of Spanish, maybe we should give Guillem the last word here since he is our guest. Guillem, Do you think there's an audience for this book outside of the academy?
I kind of hinted at that before. I think well, there are of course two views. If you think that Marx and Marxism and the theories and interpretations and whatever about Marx are something that is purely intellectual, or something that is, good to, I guess, to build a career on or to debate, fine, and then this book and all the books about Marx are only to be read by academics. But if you think that Marx's ideas have to do with political, social, economical activity, with activism, with conflict, then this book and anything that deals with it, with the topic of Marx's ideas and his theories, it should not be restricted to academy. Like what I was saying, I think at the beginning, is that the cool thing that this book manages to do is to not to rescue, because I don't think it needed to be rescued, just to dispel the myths that sort of made Marx's theoretical project harmless. You know what I mean? That made it possible to be something that you can implement in a program where you say, okay, yeah, capitalism has some features that are bad, but it's cool overall. It's something that can be corrected, and this book manages to dispel the myths that sustain that discourse. So I think that if you are going to engage in activism that goes to the root of the problems, I think it is very good to read this book and to know that there is no need to subscribe to Marx in a very vague general way, to say, yeah, well, he got some of the stuff wrong, but we can be inspired by his ideals or by his slogans. No, you can be sure that there is an interpretation that looks at what he said, reads him, and says, yeah, it makes sense, and it makes sense in a way that is not compatible with capitalism. And it's funny because I don't know. Well, sure, you're following the protests about the murder of George Floyd. Even if Marx's ideas or the whole theoretical project must be linked to everyday practice, and even if it's the spirit of protesting, of not bowing down to authority, and to be to be subservient, and to just carry on with how capitalism produces its harmful effects, that is very much present. I think it's all very related to, in a way, to what the book is defending.
Well, Guillem, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for pursuing the translation from the beginning to the conclusion, to the the actual publication of the Spanish edition.
Mm-hmm. It was a pleasure.
For a very, very long time, I've given up hope that we're actually going to be able to change the state of radical academia, especially Marxian so-called economics. But at least there's a legacy that can be left for the future.
Well, that's all the time we have on this episode of Radio Free Humanity. You can hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity on Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. If you like the podcast, please do consider leaving us a comment. You can rate the podcast, subscribe to it. You can spread it around on social media and tell all your friends and enemies. We hope to hear from you.